Maple Ridge looked like a postcard suburb. White fences, trimmed hedges, concrete sidewalks so spotless they looked polished. Every lawn was cut to regulation height, every driveway washed down before dusk. And every mailbox had the same glossy coat of blue-gray paint, because that was the HOA-approved color. But Picture Perfect came with a cost. Rules, surveillance, fines for things as petty as mismatched potted plants. The kind of neighborhood where control disguised itself as community. When Ethan Cole moved there with his 12-year-old daughter Sophie, he knew exactly what he was walking into. But he didn't care about aesthetics or lawn perfection. He cared about Sophie. About giving her a quieter life after the storm that had swallowed theirs whole. Sophie was born with a rare condition that weakened her legs and affected her lungs. She couldn't walk more than a few steps on her own. Most days, she used a wheelchair, though you'd never know it by her spirit. She had a light in her that refused to dim, even after losing her mother in a freak highway accident 2 years prior. Ethan didn't tell anyone in Maple Ridge what he did for a living. To them, he was just a single father who kept to himself, quiet and observant. No one knew he was the elected sheriff of Calhoun County, or that he'd seen more darkness than anyone in that pristine suburb would ever imagine. He wanted a fresh start, not attention. Just a safe place to raise his daughter. They moved into a modest home at the end of Alder Lane, one of the older lots, shaded by 2 tall maples and a creaky swing set left by the previous owner. The first thing Ethan did was build a ramp. It wasn't beautiful, just practical. Pressure-treated wood, bolted into concrete, with grip tape for rainy days. It let Sophie wheel herself up to the door without needing help. That's when the first complaint came. It was handwritten on a peach-colored note slipped into their mailbox. Unapproved structure. Remove ramp or face penalty. Margaret Weller, HOA president. No hello. No welcome. Just that. Margaret Weller was the kind of woman who treated neighborhood rules like federal law. Her front yard looked like a magazine spread, her roses perfectly spaced, her shrubs trimmed like topiary soldiers. She had appointed herself more than HOA president. She was judge, jury, and enforcer of Maple Ridge order. And from the day Ethan and Sophie arrived, Margaret decided they didn't fit her vision. It wasn't the ramp that offended her. It was the sight of Sophie, her wheelchair, her oxygen bag on tougher days, her presence on the porch as she watched squirrels dance in the trees. Margaret saw her as a blemish on perfection. The petty grievances came like clockwork. A letter about Sophie's physical therapy mat being visible clutter in the garage. A warning over damage to sidewalk concrete from the wheelchair's rubber marks. Even a formal noise complaint when Sophie hummed a lullaby too loudly while watching the sunset. Ethan paid the fines. Quietly. Never responded. He wasn't the kind to escalate. But inside, something coiled tighter with each new offense. The neighbors noticed. Some looked away. Others nodded with sympathy but said nothing. An older woman next door, Mrs. Landry, once left a basket of cookies on their porch with a card that read, "For your sweet girl." She never rang the bell. No one wanted Margaret's wrath. The silence made it worse. Sophie noticed, too. She asked Ethan one evening why the neighbor lady hated them. He told her she didn't. That sometimes people don't understand things they're unfamiliar with. But even he didn't believe it anymore. Margaret's disdain wasn't passive. It was sharp, calculated. She started patrolling the neighborhood at random hours, walking past their house more frequently, pausing to stare at Sophie with that cold disapproval reserved for stray cats or overgrown hedges. "She's getting special treatment because of that chair," Ethan once overheard Margaret mutter to a board member. He wanted to shout. Wanted to slam his sheriff's badge down on her manicured lawn and let her choke on the irony. But he stayed still. Because he wasn't Sheriff Cole here. He was just Sophie's dad. And protecting her peace meant swallowing his pride until he couldn't anymore. Trouble was coming. He felt it in the air. The way the birds stopped singing when Margaret walked by. The way Sophie's friends stopped visiting, their parents pulling them away when they got too close to the Cole house. The way Sophie's smile had started to fade at the edges. Then came the day the neighborhood pool became a crime scene. It was a blistering Saturday, sun high and merciless. Ethan and Sophie had gone to the community pool like they did most weekends. She loved watching the other kids splash around, even if she couldn't swim herself. Her lungs wouldn't allow it. But just sitting poolside, feet dangling, was enough for her. That afternoon, laughter echoed off the water. The scent of sunscreen and grilled hot dogs lingered in the air. Sophie's chair was parked near the deep end, away from foot traffic. Ethan sat beside her, sipping an iced tea, his guard finally down. He didn't see Margaret coming, but he heard her. Her voice, sharp and full of venom, This isn't a handicap zone. Sophie flinched. Ethan stood, calm but alert. She's not in anyone's way, he said, his voice low. Margaret didn't care. She was red-faced, trembling. Then, with a sudden burst of rage, she grabbed Sophie's wheelchair handles and shoved. The sound was louder than Ethan expected, the metallic splash as the chair hit the water, Sophie's scream as she went in with it. The world slowed. The crowd froze. Ethan ran. He didn't shout. He dove. The surface split like paper under his weight, and he was under, arms outstretched, reaching for his daughter's flailing limbs. She couldn't swim. She never could. He found her, pulled her close, kicked hard toward the light. They broke the surface to gasps and whispers and camera phones. Ethan lifted Sophie into the shallows, her tiny body slick with panic and pool water. Her lips trembled. Her breaths were shallow. Margaret stood nearby, arms folded, a sneer twisting her mouth. She's fine, Margaret said, rolling her eyes. Stop overreacting. That was when Ethan stood. Dripping wet, shirt clinging to his frame, he peeled off his jacket. The badge clipped to his belt caught the sun like a blade. You assaulted my daughter, he said, each word heavier than the last. And I'm the county sheriff. Silence fell like a thunderclap. Margaret's expression collapsed. And the reckoning began. For years, Margaret Weller had ruled Maple Ridge with the smug assurance of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to her, because she made the rules. But now, her kingdom of clipped roses and complaint letters was cracking under the weight of a single moment, a shove, a splash, a truth that could no longer be denied. She stood frozen as Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. One hand still clutched Sophie to his chest, the other was dialing. Calm. Precise. I need units at the Maple Ridge Community Pool, he said into the receiver. We have a confirmed assault. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes gave everything away, shock, panic, disbelief. She crossed a line she never imagined had consequences. Neighbors circled, cautious but curious. Phones were still up, still recording. And when Ethan stepped forward, cuffing Margaret with the same composure he used on armed criminals, no one intervened. No one defended her. You're under arrest for felony assault and reckless endangerment, Ethan said, snapping the cuffs with cold efficiency. You have the right to remain silent. It was the first time Margaret obeyed a rule in silence. Sophie, wrapped in a towel and shaking, watched as her father handled the woman who had haunted her. There were no cheers, just quiet nods from onlookers who, for years, had allowed Margaret to weaponize silence. And now, silence was all she had left. 2 deputies arrived within minutes. They placed Margaret into the back of the cruiser as the crowd quietly parted. For the first time since moving to Maple Ridge, Ethan felt the weight of his dual identity converge, father and lawman, intertwined at last, no longer hidden. He carried Sophie in his arms, her wet clothes clinging to him like a second skin, her small frame lighter than ever. She didn't speak, just rested her head against his shoulder, the trauma fresh and raw. Back at home, Ethan sat her on the couch and wrapped her in the thickest blanket he could find. Purple, the only color that ever made her smile without thinking. He brewed her favorite chamomile tea and knelt beside her as she sipped it slowly, her breath still uneven. Then came a knock. A soft one. Mrs. Landry stood at the door, her silver curls pinned back, her eyes brimming with tears. She carried a tray, 2 mugs of tea, steam curling into the hallway like warmth on a cold day. I saw everything, she said softly, voice cracking. She could have killed her. Ethan simply nodded. You're a good man, Ethan. And she's a brave girl. She placed the tray on the table, patted Sophie's hand, and left without another word. The next day, the footage from the pool went viral in the neighborhood. Emails flew. Group chats buzzed. And within 48 hours, the HOA board called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, a place usually reserved for potlucks and garden contests. Now, it was the scene of something far more consequential. The room was packed. Folding chairs scraped the polished floor. Whispers filled the air like static. Margaret, now out on bail, sat near the front, arms crossed, a fake confidence masking her unraveling composure. This was all a misunderstanding, she said loudly before the meeting began. People are overreacting. But the video said otherwise. And Ethan had come prepared. This time, he didn't arrive as the quiet man from Alder Lane. He wore his full sheriff's uniform. The badge gleamed against his dark shirt. The room shifted as he walked in, parting like a tide around him. Some stood. Some simply stared. But no one doubted why he was there. He approached the board, a trio of HOA members who looked more nervous than authoritative. They didn't meet his eyes. Ethan placed a thick folder on the table, then a flash drive. "I've brought evidence," he said. "Footage from the pool, formal documentation of past complaints, and testimony from residents." He inserted the USB into the laptop connected to the clubhouse projector. The room dimmed, and the video played. Margaret's voice echoed through the speakers. "Maybe this will teach you." The shove. The splash. Sophie screamed. Gasps rippled through the crowd like an earthquake. Someone muttered, "Monstrous." Another shook their head in disbelief. Ethan continued. He held up old fines, photocopies of every penalty Margaret had issued against him and his daughter. He pointed out the pattern, targeting Sophie's ramp, her equipment, her very presence. This was not an isolated incident, he said. It was a campaign. Mrs. Landry stood. Her voice was shaky, but loud enough to carry. "She fined me last year for daisies planted 3 inches too far from the walkway." Another voice joined. "A man from the back. She threatened to fine my son for riding his bike past her house." More stories emerged. More people rose. The quiet had finally broken, and Margaret sat in it, unraveling minute by minute. When the noise settled, Ethan faced the board. "She's unfit to lead this neighborhood," he said. "She hurt my daughter, and she's been hurting this community for years." The vote was unanimous. The decision swift. "She's removed from the HOA board," the chairman said. "Effective immediately. No ceremony. No protest. Just the sound of Margaret's last grip on control slipping away." She didn't argue. Not this time. Her face flushed white, then red, then blank. Ethan gathered his papers without a smile, without gloating. This wasn't victory. It was necessity. For Sophie. For everyone. The clubhouse, once filled with tension, now felt lighter, like a storm had passed and taken the thunder with it. But the real reckoning was still to come. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and old paper, its tall windows letting golden light. But nothing about that morning felt warm. It was the beginning of a trial no one in Maple Ridge would forget. A trial that wasn't just about an assault. It was about years of silence, intimidation, and cruelty masked as neighborhood order. Margaret Weller arrived flanked by her attorney, dressed in beige like she was heading to a country club brunch instead of a felony trial. Her confidence had dulled since the arrest. No camera crews were outside, just a few whispering neighbors and Ethan Cole, standing with his daughter's hand gently wrapped in his. The courtroom was fuller than expected. Sophie sat quietly beside her grandmother, Ethan's mother, flown in from out of state when the trial began. Sophie wore a simple dress and her new wheelchair, the one Ethan bought after the pool incident, a polished steel frame with purple accents. Her favorite color. The old one had been lost beneath 8 feet of water and fear. This one was a promise. Margaret avoided looking at them. The judge called the room to order, and the trial began. Ethan was the first to testify. He stood in his uniform, calm, collected, a professional. But his eyes, his voice, carried the weight of something deeper. Not just law enforcement, not just duty, but a father's ache. He explained how Margaret had issued repeated complaints, how she had fined him over adaptive equipment for his daughter, how she targeted the ramp, the therapy items, even the soft hum of a child sitting on a porch. "She saw my daughter as an eyesore," he said. "Not a neighbor, not a child, not a person." Then came the footage, played in open court. The same video that had stunned the HOA meeting now echoed across the walls of justice. Margaret's shrill voice, her hands gripping the handles, the violent shove, Sophie's scream, and Ethan's frantic dive into the water. Margaret's attorney objected, claimed emotional manipulation. The judge overruled. The truth was not manipulation. It was evidence. Mrs. Landry testified next. So did others from Maple Ridge. Each brought a different puzzle piece. The fines for flowers, the warnings for chalk drawings, the threats for garage doors left open too long. They painted a picture, one not of a woman simply enforcing policy, but of someone drunk on control, immune to empathy. Sophie didn't testify. She didn't have to. Her presence in the courtroom, her trembling fingers, her soft breaths as the footage played, was more than enough. The defense tried to spin it. Margaret had momentary frustration. She didn't realize the chair would roll. It was never her intent to harm. But none of it held up. Because intent didn't matter when a 12-year-old girl was coughing up pool water, her lungs rattling like paper in the wind. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. On all counts. Felony assault on a minor. Reckless endangerment. Civil violations under ADA protections. and financial penalties for punitive damages. 3 years in prison. No parole. Tens of thousands in fines. Some of the money would go to Sophie's ongoing therapy. The rest was simply a reckoning, a tangible measure of the pain she'd caused. As the verdict was read, Margaret's head dropped. The arrogance vanished. No protest. No plea. Just silence. The same silence she had used as a weapon, now turned against her. Ethan didn't watch as she was led away. He had no need for vengeance. Only closure. Later that day, at the sheriff's department, he stood by as Margaret was booked into county jail. She wouldn't meet his gaze. She stared at the floor, muttering something under her breath. He didn't respond. He wasn't there to gloat. He was there to make sure it was done right. No shortcuts. No paperwork errors. No loopholes. Just the same process every criminal went through. Afterward, he walked out into the sun. The same sun that had shone the day Sophie almost drowned. This time, it felt different. Brighter. Back home, Sophie was waiting for him, drawing at the kitchen table. Her hand moved slowly across the page, tracing butterflies and trees, stick figures and stars. Her smile, still soft, was returning. He kissed her forehead and sat beside her. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. They were safe. Justice had done its part, and Maple Ridge would never be the same again. In the weeks that followed Margaret Weller's sentencing, Maple Ridge underwent a quiet transformation. There were no parades, no press releases. Just small, subtle shifts, like the first spring breeze after a long winter. The kind of changes that weren't announced, but felt. The threat was gone, but the damage lingered. Ethan noticed it first in Sophie. She still flinched when sudden voices rose. Still hesitated when she rolled out onto the porch, as though waiting for someone to scold her for merely existing. Trauma doesn't vanish with a verdict. It unwinds slowly, day by day. But healing had begun. Ethan replaced the old ramp with a new one. It wasn't just a home improvement. It was a statement. Solid pine, reinforced rails, anti-slip coating. But most importantly, he left it unpainted. It was a blank canvas. A few days after Margaret's sentencing, the neighborhood kids came by. One held a box of sidewalk chalk. Another brought paintbrushes and cans of color. Ethan watched from the porch as they asked Sophie, shyly at first, if they could decorate it. She nodded, then smiled. And for the next hour, the ramp became something else entirely. Handprints. Swirls of blue and gold. Stick figures holding hands. A giant sun with a smiley face. One boy painted a rocket ship. A girl added a heart with Sophie's name in the center. When it was done, Sophie clapped. The ramp was no longer just an entry point. It was a mural. A symbol. A declaration that this house was a home, and this child belonged. Mrs. Landry came by with a fresh batch of cookies. For the artist, she said, handing Sophie the warm tin. There were chocolate chips shaped into a smiley face. Sophie shared one with Ethan, crumbs falling into her lap as she giggled. It had been so long since he'd heard that sound without pain behind it. Maple Ridge's HOA changed leadership. The new board, quiet, fair, and surprisingly humble, revoked dozens of old fines and restructured the complaint process entirely. They even installed new policies for disability accommodations, partnering with ADA advisors to ensure no one else would suffer the way Sophie did. People relaxed. They planted flowers without fear. Kids rode their bikes in groups again. Lawn flamingos reappeared. So did porch swings. The neighborhood stopped chasing perfection and started embracing presence. Ethan was still the sheriff. But around Maple Ridge, he was just Ethan again. Not a title. Not a uniform. Just a man who had built a life out of the ashes of grief and stood firm when it mattered most. He spent more time at home now. He and Sophie had a routine. Breakfast at 7:30, therapy at 10, drawing at 4. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, him with lemonade, her wrapped in her purple blanket, the painted ramp glowing beneath the fading light. One night, Sophie looked up from her chair, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she hated me?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I think she feared you." "Why?" "Because you're strong. And people like her don't know how to handle that." Sophie nodded slowly. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Her fingers found the edges of her blanket and held them tight. Her breathing was steady. Ethan placed his hand on hers. "You're brave," he said. "And you're loved. That's all that matters now." For the first time, Sophie reached out, not to be held, but to hold. And Ethan let himself exhale. Maple Ridge still had its fences and flower beds, but now it had stories too. Stories of survival, of quiet resistance, of little victories that added up to something bigger. The neighborhood would never forget what happened at that pool, nor the girl who endured it. But it would also remember what came after. The colors on the ramp never faded. Even when rain came. Even when the wind howled through Alder Lane. Someone was always out there, touching up the paint, adding new designs, keeping it alive. It had become more than wood and nails. It had become the heart of Maple Ridge. The season shifted gently over Maple Ridge, as if even nature had decided to stop rushing. Trees along Alder Lane rustled with golden leaves, and the air in the mornings carried that cool clarity that only autumn could bring. But it wasn't just the weather that had changed. The rhythm of the neighborhood had softened, less rigid, more human. Months had passed since Margaret Weller's sentencing, yet her absence still echoed in subtle ways. The clipped tones of her voice no longer snapped across driveways. The threatening notices in mailboxes were gone. The HOA newsletters, once stern and inflexible, now read more like invitations than warnings. No one mentioned her name anymore, not out of fear, but because no one wanted to give it space. Maple Ridge had chosen to move forward, not backward. And in that movement, something remarkable unfolded. Sophie had started painting again, this time not just on ramps or sidewalks, but on canvases Ethan had hung for her in the den. Abstract bursts of color, some soft and dreamlike, others wild and chaotic. When asked what they meant, she would shrug and smile. Their feelings, she'd say, but in color. Ethan began collecting her artwork, carefully labeling each one by date. He wasn't sure why, maybe to remember how far she'd come, or maybe because some part of him still feared the quiet might shatter again. But it didn't. The ramp, now lovingly referred to by neighbors as Sophie's Walkway, became a kind of landmark. Children came to see it. Some brought paint to add their own touches. One day, a group of teenagers left a single message in cursive glitter: "This place matters." And it did. It mattered because it reminded people of something easy to forget, that dignity is not earned through conformity. That kindness isn't a policy. That strength often wears the face of a small girl in a wheelchair who refused to stop smiling. Ethan kept a low profile. He still wore the badge, still drove the cruiser, still responded to calls. But within Maple Ridge, his role had subtly shifted. Neighbors greeted him not with formal nods, but with trust. Once, he walked Sophie through the park, her new chair gliding effortlessly over the paved paths, and a young boy stopped them. "Are you really the sheriff?" he asked, eyes wide. Ethan nodded. "Cool," the boy whispered, then turned to Sophie. "And you're the girl from the ramp, right?" Sophie grinned. "Yep, that's me." He looked between them, then said, "My sister's in a chair too. I'm gonna help her paint ours." It was a simple moment, fleeting, but it stuck with Ethan like a stone in his chest, not heavy, just present. Proof that their story had gone further than he realized. The HOA sent a letter that winter, this time addressed to Sophie. It wasn't a notice. It was an award, in recognition of bravery, resilience, and the spirit that helped reshape our community. It came with a plaque. Ethan mounted it beside the front door, just above the edge of the ramp. Sophie didn't say much when she saw it. She just ran her fingers across the engraving and whispered, "That's nice." Life settled into something stable, something precious. Ethan stopped checking the locks 3 times before bed. Sophie started sleeping through the night again. Mrs. Landry became a regular fixture, often bringing over stories and recipes, and sometimes just sitting on the porch in companionable silence. The neighborhood didn't become perfect. People still argued about parking spaces and fence heights. But the cruelty had left. The fear was gone. And in its place, something better had taken root. One evening, nearly a year after the incident, Ethan found Sophie sitting on the ramp alone, bundled in her purple blanket, looking up at the stars. "What you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. She leaned her head against his arm. "Nothing bad," she said. "Just how it feels different now." "Good different." She nodded. "Yeah, like, people can see me now. Not just the chair." Ethan looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and felt his heart ache in the best way. "You were never invisible, kiddo," he said. "But I'm glad they finally caught up." They stayed like that for a while, bathed in moonlight, wrapped in memory and new beginnings. The ramp creaked softly beneath them. It wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a monument, not to tragedy, but to transformation.